Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see your bright and shining faces around America. Thank you for joining us for Online Home Church yet again today. And celebrating the Feast of the Transfiguration, which we celebrate on the church calendar this past Friday, and yet again getting the opportunity to reflect on the Gospel of John in his 6th chapter, where we hear these stories and sayings of Jesus as the bread of life. I'll first of all say that just like last week, when we heard the story of the people of Israel in the wilderness and the manna from heaven that came down from God and kept them alive as they wandered in the wilderness for those times, our Old Testament lesson today directly tells us this connection between Jesus and the bread of life. Only this time, it's not the entire people of Israel, it's Elijah, who lays down under this broom tree and throws in the towel. He's exhausted from his ministry and he's ready to just give up. But God sends him an angel and gives him baked cakes that are so full of protein and drink that is so satisfying. He goes for 40 days and 40 nights towards Mount Horeb. Will and I talk, my son Will, who's joining us today with his friend Kylie and their family in Charlotte, North Carolina. Will and I talk a lot about protein as he prepares for the fall and the upcoming season next year. Well, those are some serious protein cakes that God delivered to Elijah, that he could run for 40 days and 40 nights on those. But it's not just protein, it's life-fulfilling, life-satisfying, life-giving bread and water that we hear about, not just for Elijah, but in our gospel lesson today. In fact, this is one of the unique places in the lectionary, everybody, where a verse from last week's gospel is repeated in this week's gospel. It's a bridge of sorts. And so that first verse that you heard in our gospel lesson today, I am the bread of life. Whoever eats of this bread shall not perish, and he who drinks of me will not thirst. That's the way we ended our gospel lesson last week. But Jesus goes on to say, once the Jews who are surrounding him and criticizing him, and as our gospel says today, complaining about him, they're saying, hey, you're the carpenter's kid, right? We know you. You grew up in Nazareth. How can you say that you're from God? And he goes on to say, really the refrain from our hymn last week, that terrific version of I am the bread of life that was sung by the Notre Dame choir, and I sent out to y'all on Wednesday of this week. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that upbeat version of I am the bread of life, I encourage you to do so. It'll put a spring in your step. And it says what we see in our gospel lesson today. I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger. No one shall come to me unless the Father draws him or her, and I will raise him up or her up on the last day. And so we get a couple of things going on in our gospel lesson today, everybody. The first is this nourishment that God gives to Elijah thousands of years before Jesus comes along. And now Jesus explains to everybody, I am the nourishment that you seek, just like the people of Israel in the wilderness, just like this life-giving food and water that God gave to Elijah, only this time that's me. He also says, I will raise them up on the last day. And this is a part of our theology as Christians that we don't really talk about much, especially because in the lectionary that we're given in the Episcopal Church, we spend very little time on the book of Revelation. Yet it's worth mentioning today because you'll hear it later in our Eucharistic prayer. First of all, let me just say one of my favorite preachers and a role model for me during my time and as I grow and develop in my ministry is Billy Graham. And a woman that I care for very much on my ordination 7 years ago gave me a book that he had written called The Reason for My Hope is Salvation. And that's really what we're talking about here in this gospel lesson today. Jesus promises us salvation through him as the bread of life. That notion, that theological premise is called eschatology, which is based on the Greek word eschaton, which basically means the end. And we repeat it every Sunday, but rarely talk about it. Y'all probably hear me in the Eucharistic prayer say, and at the last day. I like to place particular emphasis on that phrase because of the eschatology of what we celebrate in our communion. So listen up for that today, because when we repeat it in our Eucharistic prayer and have communion together in this new format of online home church, we remember not just the sacrifice that Jesus gave to us to save us all from sin, but this eschatology takes us forward into the future and gives us hope for salvation. So at the last day, we will all be raised up like we hear about in our gospel lesson today. But what I want to focus on this morning with y'all is a story not just about the nourishment that Jesus gives us as the bread of life, but the quenching satisfaction he gives us so that everyone who believes in him shall not thirst. Last week, we talked about somebody that I'd met at the airport chapel who asked for food and I had none, and yet God provided him some within just a few minutes. This week, our story is about thirst. Y'all may recall a couple of weeks ago, we were celebrating Rebecca's birthday and went up to Durham, North Carolina to try and see Will play on Team USA. That it was a rainy day, crazy weather, and luckily the baseball game was played. But unfortunately, despite our best efforts to will the coach to put Will into the baseball game, he didn't get in the game. So we didn't get a chance to see him play, and it was disappointing. As it turns out, he played the next day, Tuesday, July 20th, and did just fine. We've talked about Tuesday, July 20th in sermons before, because that's the day we got the flat tire on I-85 after landing in Atlanta from Raleigh-Durham. The crazy day with the cat coming out of the wilderness to entertain us while we were repairing the flat tire. What we didn't talk about is our trip down from Durham. So Rebecca and I arrived at the airport, at RDU Airport at 5:30 on Tuesday morning, bleary-eyed after a short night's sleep, but ready to take our flight down to Atlanta to meet Caroline, our daughter, and Sarah Beth, her friend, for this trip down to Florida. When we got to the airport, we were early, which is unusual. Got to what we thought was our gate and settled in to read and just get ready for the flight. But about 30 minutes before boarding time, there was no gate agent and nobody milling about as if they're ready to board a plane. And I thought, that's weird. I wonder if the plane has been rescheduled or somehow delayed. And looked up, and it turns out that Rebecca and I, in our early morning state of mind, had gone to the wrong gate for a flight to Atlanta that left an hour and a half later. And so we quickly realized our mistake and hustled about 500 yards from the gate where we were to the proper gate and made our plane on time. It was a lovely blood pressure spike and an opportunity to get some cardiovascular exercise in bright and early at 6:30 in the morning. But we made the flight, and nonetheless, we're happy. And an otherwise, doldrum morning. We had gone all the way to Durham to see Will play, and he didn't get in the game. When we got on the airplane, though, our hopes were further diminished of meeting the girls on time down in Atlanta, because the captain, as so often airline captains do in July, said, well, there's bad weather in between Durham and Atlanta, everybody. We're going to be delayed. Air traffic control in Atlanta has said, we're going to sit here for the next 45 minutes. And so we sat on the plane in the heat of the early morning in Durham and just relaxed, read. Some of us worked. And the flight attendants, you know how that is when you're on an airplane and you get this message that things are not on time. Everybody's starting to panic about their connecting flights in Atlanta. And there was definitely some anxiety on the airplane. But the flight attendants started handing out bottles of water because we were all sitting there in the heat of the day without the air conditioner being on because of the way the plane had to conserve its fuel. Well, 45 minutes later, we finally got rolling, got in the air, and are heading now south from North Carolina to Georgia. During that time, the flight attendants who had passed out the water and were so gracious to give us something to quench our thirst had all settled in for the flight. Well, Rebecca and I got up on this plane, which is pretty big, I would think, all things considered. It was enough for a couple of hundred people. Rebecca and I got up to go to the back alley to stretch our legs. And I said, well, did you get enough water from the flight attendants when they passed through? She said, no, I could use another bottle. And I said, okay. And so I'll get us one. But after that, I kind of lost track of her because of the way the plane is positioned and the restrooms are kind of facing opposite directions. Anyway, once I got to the back alley and was talking to the flight attendant, whose name is Jan, I had lost track of Rebecca and whether she was still in the back or had gone back to our seats. And I said, ma'am, thank you for passing out the water earlier. We appreciate that. May I have another couple of bottles? And she got this look on her face of concern and said, "Oh gosh, did we not give you water when we came through the first time?" And I said, "No, you absolutely did. But it's a hot day. We had a long hot day yesterday and last night at the ball field. We would just like some more. And I'm not sure my wife grabbed any for us before she returned to our seats." The lady got this big grin on her face and said, "I'd be happy to give you some water. I'd be happy to give you some water." And I said, "Well, we sure would appreciate it. It's hot out there and we've got a long day. Who knows?" I had no idea how long it was going to be with a pit stop on I-85 with a flat tire just a few hours later. But I said, "Thank you, and I really appreciate it," and returned to my seat. I didn't make much of it. I was just asking a flight attendant for some water. But I quickly learned, once she brought the water to us, how important it was to ask her for some assistance in quenching our thirst. No sooner had I returned with the bottles of water that she had given us and given a couple to Rebecca, and we started drinking, then here comes the flight attendant up the aisle of the airplane with this big grin on her face and a note. You see, she had told us during that time, as she delivered the water to us, that she was having a really difficult morning herself, that her father, whose name is Griff, and y'all may have heard me pray for in the last couple of weeks, is dying of cancer and had had a particularly bad morning. Now, as a reminder, it's 7:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. And so she had already gotten this news from her father and was already very upset about it. But she got this big grin on her face and said, "I just want to thank you for your kindness." And I said, "Well, Jan," and I grabbed her hand at this point and said, "Jan, I appreciate that, but all I did was ask for water. We appreciate you for your kindness in helping us quench our thirst." And she said, "No, it's the graciousness that you showed to me in this time of need. And the fact that I can tell y'all are good people, that really gives me some hope." And so I want to pass that along to y'all today. She gave us this note that said, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Sanders, thank you so much for flying with Delta today. I hope to see you on another flight in the future." And that was lovely customer service. But I want to pass that along to y'all today because last week we talked about how in the life of Christians that we seek, in this path of Christ that we seek to follow, we look to help others as best we can. That's why so many churches around the globe have food ministries that try and nourish those children of God who lack. But it's also an important reminder, this story that I tell you today from our flight 2 weeks ago, it's an important reminder that it's okay to ask for help. And sometimes, even in the process of asking for help, you can shine the light of Christ to others and give them satisfaction and let them show their love to you so that they may likewise be fulfilled. This woman, Jan, was just wonderful. What a wonderful person. She had a cross dangling on her necklace. So I could tell that she had in her heart the light of Christ that Rebecca and I did. And so I tell you this story not to say, "Hey, look how cool it was that Rebecca and I asked for water," but so much to say that when we talk about the transfiguration, when we talk about this terrific scene in the gospel lesson from Friday, where Jesus goes up to the mountain with Peter and James and John and Andrew, his most trusted disciples, and they're up on the mountain and they see Moses and Elijah, who's in our Old Testament lesson today, and these figures from the history of the ancient people of Israel up on this mountain. And then all of a sudden, Jesus's clothes are transfigured into this dazzling white, and his face is changed so that it shines as brightly as the sun. In that moment of transfiguration, God comes down from the cloud and says, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And Peter and James and John absolutely are terrified. Absolutely are terrified. But in that moment, Peter says, "Let's build dwellings for Moses and Elijah. Let's set up shop here on Mount Horeb because this is a holy place." But the minute he says that, Moses and Elijah disappear, and Jesus, his teacher, his friend, his role model, and his savior is there with transfigured clothes and transfigured form. That is the celebration of the transfiguration that we remember. And it's that transfiguration that we receive through baptism. And so in this moment that Rebecca and I shared with our flight attendant, Jan, just 2 weeks ago, that light of Christ that we always talk about, that shines in our heart, shined not just from us to her, but from her to us. It's that moment of satisfaction, that moment of quenching of thirst that helps us all as believers get through even the toughest of times. And so I want to ask y'all this week, as you face yet another set of trials and tribulations, the Delta variant doing what it's going to do. Yesterday, I'm reading on the news now, there's a Lambda variant running around southern parts of the United States in Louisiana, and we all kind of brace for another round of what comes next in life. Just remember that not only is the light of Christ in you because of the way that you live your life and the way you believe, but it's in others. And when you ask for help, you give that person the chance to shine their light of Christ on you, so that we all can remember the lesson that Jesus gave us in our gospel today. I am the bread of life, and on the last day, I will raise them up. Amen.
Amen.
And now with Christians around the world and across time, let's say together the Nicene Creed.